Okay, everybody, thank you for coming. Quick announcement, if you're in Philosophy 205, you will be getting a email from me later today about remaining things, so just keep an eye out for that. This is our final visiting lecture of the year. I'm very excited to welcome Sharad Goel, who is an assistant professor at Stanford University, where he works in the Department of Management, Science, and Engineering. He works at the intersection of computer science, statistics, and public policy, and he's tackling such topics as stop and frisk, racial bias, swing voting, voter fraud, online privacy, or a host of really interesting topics. He did his undergraduate work at the University of Chicago and then his master's and PhD at Cornell University. And before ending up at Stanford, he worked at Microsoft Research. His talk today is entitled Law, Order, and Algorithms, A New Approach to Criminal Justice. Please join me in welcoming Sharad Goel.
Thanks for the introduction. So I'm going to try to keep this pretty informal, so please feel free to ask questions, and I'll clarify as I go along. So last month, the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, John Roberts, he was giving a talk at RPI in New York, and he got this question from the president of the university: can you foresee a day when smart machines driven with artificial intelligences will assist with courtroom fact-finding, or more controversially even, judicial decision-making? So his response was spot on, and he said it's a day that's here. So I'll try to convince you that in fact this is a good thing, that there are a lot of problems with the way that humans are making decisions, and algorithms are at least a partial solution for bringing equity into the criminal justice system. So first I want to start out with some of the issues of human decision making. So I'm going to use this example of stop and frisk in New York. So stop and frisk is, as I suspect many of you already know, is this controversial police practice in which officers stop, question, potentially frisk and search individuals who are walking down the street when they suspect criminal activity. So up until recently, so this is a practice that's used in every major city in the US, and in New York in particular, it was in heavy use. About 500,000 people or 500,000 stops were conducted every year. New York is a big city, about 8 million people. 500,000 stops is a lot of stops though. And so this was a widespread practice. It's since curtailed in the last few years, in part because of a court case. But really it had a lot of stops were happening for quite a long time in New York City. Now, people raise quite a few issues with this practice, but one of the most prominent is this claim that it's racially biased. And one statistic that's often thrown out regarding this claim is that about 80% of people who are stopped are Black or Hispanic, and in the base rate in the population is about 50%. So Black and Hispanic individuals make up about half of the New York City population, but they comprise about 80% of the stops in New York City. And so this strikes a lot of people as there something fundamentally wrong with this police practice, and it's going towards this claim of racial bias. So the first question is this evidence of bias? So what do you think? This is the claim, 80% of people, or 80% of stops in New York City involve Black and Hispanic individuals. About 50% of people in New York City are Black or Hispanic.
Yeah, it is, because we define bias.
So this is a really good question. What is bias? And so right now I'm gonna punt on that, and I'm gonna try to build this up. It turns out that it's not an easy question of what bias is. So if you just see the statistic, how many people say, okay, I'm convinced this is a biased policy? Raise your hand if you think this is a biased policy. Okay, so a lot of people are persuaded. So anyone not believe that this statistic alone? Again, this isn't to say that the policy is not biased. The question is this an argument or is this evidence that convinces you that it's a biased policy? So who thinks not? Everyone is complete agreement. So then I guess I should just walk away. We're done with the talk. Yes?
I don't think it's not
Okay, so can you elaborate on that?
Just the fact that the 30% differential in the statistic doesn't really mean that much. Again, I do think it is very biased in itself, but I don't think that statistic alone can prove that.
Okay, and so what is a race-neutral explanation? I'll posit that there are two major problems with this statistic. And so I'll try to convince you that in fact this statistic is not particularly strong evidence that the policy is biased. So there are two major problems with this statistic. What is one of them?
How did they gather this? Is it the people who spoke up about it, or is it, because I'm pretty sure they don't log every single person that they check?
So this is a great question. First of all, are the data accurate? In this case, every stop, so this 500,000 number that I gave you, these are all recorded stops. So there was a previous court case that because of these types of issues required the NYPD to start recording stops. Now that's not to say that actually every stop that happens is recorded, but quite a few stops are recorded. And so among recorded stops, this is the distribution. So among recorded stops, and you might think it's even more extreme among non-recorded stops, but among recorded stops, we do see this pretty big disparate impact, this disparity between the minorities who are stopped and their base rate in the population. So I'll ask maybe one more. Anyone else want to posit, offer a guess of what could be wrong with this? So let me give you the one answer. So one is that minorities, and this is the answer that Howard Safer, the New York City Police Commissioner at the time gave, is that minorities may commit more crimes. And so this is what he's saying. The racial ethnic distribution of subjects of stop and frisk reports reflects the demographics of known violent crime suspects as reported by crime victims. So it's a very simple explanation. It's saying, well, if the reason that there are more Black and Hispanic individuals who are stopped is because Black and Hispanic individuals are more likely to commit crimes. And the point of the policy is to stop people from committing crimes. Now, there are all sorts of problems with this statement, which I'll also get into in a minute. But at its surface, this is, I would say, a pretty compelling rebuttal to the statistic alone that a disproportionate number of people who are stopped are, in fact, that disproportionate number of people who are stopped are minorities is evidence of discrimination. You say, well, that's not really true because, in fact, the policy is just trying to stop people who are criminal, and people who are criminal are disproportionately minority. That's the claim. Okay, so this is one issue. Now, the second issue with the statement is a little bit more subtle, and it's that stop and frisk itself is a hyper-local strategy. So New York City is this big metropolis, 8 million people spread all over, and if you look at these maps, New York City is incredibly dense. This entire area, this is Manhattan here, this entire island is populated with people, and same over here, but in fact, stop and frisk is really only happening in a few of these neighborhoods. So why is it only happening in a few of these neighborhoods? In part because that's where the crime is. So here are the stops, and here are the murders in New York City. It's just one metric of where the crime is. But if you look at any of these metrics, we see that the police are deploying resources precisely where the crime is happening. But if you do that, it happens that New York City, like many major cities in the US, are incredibly segregated. That the areas with high crime also happen to be areas that are predominantly minority. So another race-neutral explanation for this statistic that a disproportionate number of people who are stopped are minorities is that the police are deploying resources in high-crime neighborhoods. Because those high-crime neighborhoods are predominantly comprised of minorities, then the people who are stopped are going to be predominantly minority. So this again is a race-neutral, I would say a non-discriminatory explanation for that simple statistic. And again, the point isn't to say that the policy is not biased, and I'm going to actually try to convince you that it is biased, but the point is to say that this simple statistic isn't sufficient to establish that claim. Okay, so are we all on the same page so far? Okay, so now this is what's many people in statistics call the omitted variable problem, in that there are all sorts of unobservables that we don't account for when we make these aggregate statistics. And so Gary Becker, he's a Nobel-winning economist, he proposed this very clever and simple way around this problem. So it only takes 30 seconds to explain, but it really gets you 90% of the way towards understanding how you can measure discrimination. So the idea is that you're not going to look at the rate at which people are stopped. So that's problematic because we don't know what the benchmark is. We don't know how many people in the population are actually committing crime. Right? That's what we would like to know, and then we compare those two things, but we don't know that. That's just very hard to estimate. And so instead, what we're going to look at is we're going to say, look at all the people who are stopped, just that population. We have data on all the people who are stopped, and we're going to ask, how often were those stops successful? And successful in this case, in the case of stop and frisk, usually means finding weapons or drugs. So some form of contraband. And why look at that statistic? So it's a very simple statistic. So we have 500,000 stops. We can look at everyone who was stopped, and we say, well, how often were those stops successful? How often in every one of those 500,000 cases did you find contraband? Did you find weapons or drugs? And the idea is that if on minorities you find weapons and drugs less often when they're stopped than you do on white individuals who are stopped, that suggests that the bar for stopping minorities was lower than the bar for stopping white individuals. Okay, so it's a very simple argument. It's repeat it, but it's clever. And again, so Becker actually introduced this in his Nobel acceptance speech. So he could talk about a lot of things. He chose to talk about this, and so it's a big idea. It's a very simple idea. It's easy to miss the importance of it, but it is in my mind a profound shift from how we normally measure discrimination with the benchmark test by looking at rates of stops to this outcome approach, which gets us around the fact that we don't know the distribution of the population of people who are committing crimes. So again, what is the test? The test is you look at everyone who is stopped, you break it up by race group. So you say, look at all the people, all the black individuals who are stopped, all the white individuals who are stopped, all the Hispanic individuals who are stopped. In each of these groups, you compute the hit rate, the success rate of those stops. So how often among stopped blacks, whites, Hispanics do you find weapons or drugs? Okay, so it's a simple test, and the idea is if you're finding the extreme case, if when you stop white individuals you find contraband on them 90% of the time, but when you stop minorities you find contraband 1% of the time, it suggests that you're applying two different standards. That you're willing to stop minorities just when you have a hunch that they have contraband, but you only stop whites when you really believe that they have contraband on them. And that would be one way of defining discrimination, that we're setting different standards for different groups. Okay, so what happens when we do this? So we do find that white individuals are when they are stopped, contraband is found in them about 11% of the time, and for black and Hispanic individuals, about 3 or 4% of the time. So there's a significant disparity in the hit rate of whites and blacks and Hispanics. Okay, so again, this is evidence of discrimination. And in fact, this is not, so we still have this problem, well, what about these local effects? What if different areas are applying different standards and there's this funny aggregation? Well, it turns out that if you look at all of these different, so each dot here is a location in New York City. If you look at all these different locations, you see that in essentially every one of them, white individuals, the hit rate is higher than the hit rate for, in this case, black individuals. So again, it suggests that in every neighborhood in New York City that we look at, that we're finding that you're more likely to find contraband on whites who are stopped than minorities who are stopped. So again, suggesting that the bar for searching minorities was lower than the bar for searching whites. So this is one way of defining discrimination when you're applying two different standards. Okay, so good. So again, we have a little bit of stronger evidence now that there's biased decision making happening here. So now we're going to actually point out a flaw with this test. And this is the nature of discrimination, that it's actually very, very hard to definitively determine if we are observing discrimination. And so I want to show you one problem with this outcome test. So it's a very clever test. At the same time, it's not perfect. So here's the example. So suppose that we have this race-neutral stop policy. Officer looks at somebody, they try to figure out what's the likelihood that you have contraband. Say 10%, 20%, 5%. They're like trying to, in their mind, they're trying to think, well, what's the likelihood this person has contraband? I think that's a pretty reasonable thing to do. And then they're going to stop people if that likelihood of having contraband is above 10%, irregardless of race. So it's just, this is what we're going to do. It's race neutral. We wouldn't call this a discriminatory policy. So now, suppose the world looks like this. Suppose there are two types of white individuals, people who have a 1% chance of having contraband, and people who have a 75% chance of having contraband. Okay, so there's exactly two types of white individuals. And suppose that there are also two types of black individuals. Those who have a 1% chance of having contraband and a 50% chance of having contraband. So that's it. We have these four types of people in the world, two types of white people, two types of black people. The chance of having contraband is exactly one of these numbers. What's going to happen when you apply this race-neutral stop policy? What is the likelihood of finding contraband on stopped whites?
More than stop blacks.
More than stop blacks, exactly. So what is it exactly? What is the number? When you stop a white, what is the likelihood?
5% of the time.
Exactly. And why is that? Well, I mean, you're not going to stop these people, you're only going to stop these people because the policy says only stop them if they're above 75%. So you're going to stop exactly, sorry, the policy says only stop people if they're above 10%. So you're going to get exactly these people. And so then the hit rate is 75% for whites. If you do the exact same policy for blacks, you find 50% hit rate. The outcome test suggests there's a discrimination against blacks. Okay? So outcome test, and we know in this fictitious world there is no discrimination, but the outcome test still suggests that there's discrimination. And that's a problem. Because now we don't want the test to tell us there's discrimination when we know that there's not discrimination. And it turns out this can happen in reverse as well. You can describe situations where there is discrimination and where the test is going to suggest that there's no discrimination. So the outcome test is this powerful test, but at the same time, it's not perfect. It can make these types of statistical errors. So there's a way around it. So I'm not going to describe the way around that problem. That unfortunately is not a 30-second solution. So Becker's solution is this elegant formulation of trying to get around some of the problems with discrimination tests. It's super simple to explain. Here we developed a new method for trying to infer these types of thresholds directly. So we're not going to look at hit rate. We're going to try to understand the standard that is being applied to every individual. The downside is, the upside is that it's more statistically robust. The downside is that it's hard to explain. So I'll point you to a paper that's on my website if you're interested. But right now I'll just give you the punchline. So what are the results? So when we run this, when we actually try to infer the thresholds, so not just the hit rates, but the actual thresholds, what do we find? We again find that the stop threshold for whites is higher in almost, these are all areas in the city. So the stop threshold for whites is consistently higher than the stop threshold for blacks. So again, that is our definition of discrimination, that we find evidence that officers applying this double standard in nearly every location in the city, the standard applied for stopping black individuals is lower than the standard applied to stopping white individuals. So again, evidence of discrimination. Okay, so is there discrimination in police stops? And I want to highlight these 2 points that I have tried to convey in the first few minutes of the talk. Is first, probably yes. So every way we look at this problem, we do see evidence of discrimination. Even when we use these increasingly sophisticated tests, we're finding evidence of discrimination. But the flip side is it's incredibly difficult to determine this. And these standard tests that you hear, these standard numbers that you often hear floating around in the media, for example, look at this disproportionate number of minorities who are affected by the policy versus the number of whites who are affected by the policy, is a start, but it's really only a start. And that statistic in and of itself is not, in my mind, strong evidence of discrimination. So it's an incredibly subtle problem of identifying rigorously, is there this bias in human decision making? At the same time, when we go through all the motions, we do find quite compelling, in my mind, evidence of discrimination in stop and frisk, at least in New York City. Okay, so one more caveat, and then I'll move on, is that bias, however we want to define this, is not the same thing as racial animus. And so there are a variety of reasons that could be, a lot of mechanisms that could be driving the results that we see. For example, there might be implicit bias, there might just be poor judgment, either at the level of the police chief or even at the level of the individual officer. So there are all sorts of ways in which this type of phenomenon could arise. And it's important to understand these both for our interventions and also for the legal implications of these types of findings. So again, I feel it's important to keep these things separate. So racial animus versus, for example, one extreme of implicit bias. Okay, so the first part of the talk was just to establish that there are these pretty serious issues with individual human decision makers. These are highly consequential decisions. Officers on the street making hundreds of thousands, millions of stops over several years of individuals, and if we see these types of biased decision making, we should have quite reasonably cause for concern. So now where do algorithms come in? So we looked at the exact same data from New York City. We built a statistical model that says, based on all the information that's recorded in these stops, how can we help officers make better decisions? And the idea here is that we're going to look at the factors that officers are marking down that suggest that even though they might not realize this factor matters and that other factor doesn't matter, what it is that's helping people, what it eventually is predictive of finding weapons, of finding contraband. So we're going to do a statistical analysis of all of these millions of stops And the policy is only to stop people who are deemed the riskiest. So when we do this, what do we find? We find that you can make about a third fewer stops with almost no drop in the number of weapons recovered. And so this is a pretty significant drop. So we're talking again about hundreds of thousands of individuals that if you make these stops in this statistical way, you could say, well, actually, I never should have stopped that person because there's really no objective evidence to suggest that this person has weapons or drugs on them. And a lot of those stops fall into this category. So using these types of statistical tools, we can advise officers and say, well, these are the stops that you should focus on, and these are stops that you can ignore. And the benefit is that many fewer people are stopped, and there's relatively little cost in terms of public safety because you're getting the same number of weapons off the streets. So this was a surprising result. Now, one thing that's interesting, an interesting implication of this, is that efficiency improves equity. In that many of the stops, so in two ways. So efficiency improves equity, and in the first way is that many of the people who are stopped are already minorities, they're already black or Hispanic. And so if you're reducing the number of stops, you're also just reducing the absolute number of black and Hispanic individuals who are stopped. The second way is that a lot of these bad stops, these low-ranked stops, the stops that are least likely to recover contraband, involve minorities. And in part that's because of discrimination, in part that's because of these highly local policing strategies that concentrate resources in these high crime, high minority areas. And if you start making statistically informed decisions, then you drop those types of stops out. And so it's helping in equity in these two ways, even though the model doesn't actually understand equity in and of itself, it's just trying to make good decisions. But when you make good decisions, they tend to be double good. They tend to be good in the sense of improving efficiency, but they also tend to be good in that they're reducing racial disparities. So let me give you another example where we applied this type of approach. So this is pretrial release decisions. So here the judge is trying to decide, this is pretrial, so the defendant has just been arrested, usually within 24 hours. They appear in front of a judge. The judge now has to make this highly consequential decision of should this individual be released or detained pending trial. If they're detained pending trial, if bail is set for that individual, then they often will either not be able to pay the bail, even if what I think many of us would think are small amounts. So most people who interact with the criminal justice system can't pay these even relatively small amounts of bail, and so they're stuck in jail waiting trial. And now that has all sorts of consequences: social consequences, financial consequences. And even if they do pay bail and they're out, they still have to pay bail, which again is a pretty big financial burden. And so this is a major decision. And remember, all of this is being done before trial, so under the presumption of innocence. So these individuals haven't been convicted of any crime, but yet they have these pretty severe, they're potentially pretty severe penalties before they even have a trial. So the goal for the judicial decision maker is to balance flight risk and public safety. I mean, that's what their duty to society is. At the same time, they want to limit the burden on defendants who haven't even been convicted of a crime yet. Okay, so what do? So we apply the same thing. We look at all this information. We look at 100,000 plus cases in one of the largest cities in the US. We cull through the records, and we find that about half, you could reduce the number of defendants detained by about half without increasing the number of defendants who skip trial. So again, this is a significant change. So using these statistical approach, this algorithm, to help judges make these decisions, we can significantly reduce the people who are defendants who are subject to bail, and at the same time have almost no cost to society. And so what do these algorithms look like? So we worked hard. So we started with these black box algorithms that you couldn't really explain to people. And this has all sorts of bad problems in that it's hard to turn to a judge and say, well, use this algorithm that I can't explain to you, that you can't explain to the defendant, and you're just going to have to trust it. And this is, I think, a lot of how computer science works. At the same time, it doesn't match up with how we do public policy. And so we worked really hard to find these simple algorithms. So what is a simple algorithm? It actually ends up being something that fits on a note card. And so it's surprising that we have to go through hundreds of thousands of cases to develop this, but at the end, the result fits on a note card. And so what is it? So it's just two scores, one for age and one for past court dates missed. And so now we take someone who's, let's say, a 35-year-old defendant with one missed court date. We look at their score for age, it's 2. We look at their score for past court dates missed, it's 6. We add them up, we have 8. And now we're going to set a threshold. So we're going to say, well, only detain people if their score is above 10. And in this case, their score is 8, so we release them. So it's very, very simple. It turns out that this performs essentially identically to the best black box algorithms, which again it's a surprising result to me. I thought there'd be some trade-off here, but we consistently find this, that these very, very simple rules are performing comparably to our state-of-the-art black box machine learning algorithms. Okay, so another way to graphically represent this rule is just with a grid. So we have age, we have prior number of missed court dates on the y-axis, and then in this area on the lower left, we're going to release. In this area up here, we're going to detain. So again, it's very simple. It fits on a note card. It's explainable. It makes sense. We do believe that as people get older, the risk lowers. As people have a history of missing court dates, that's indicative of missing future court dates. So we believe the underlying model here. And so I think it's a much more palatable type of algorithm to show to a defendant, to show to a judge, and to ensure trust in the judicial system. So why is it that our algorithm is able to outperform judges? And the idea is that judges, in fact, are just really bad in making these types of heuristic decisions. So let me give you an example. So here is our grid. So we would say, release all the people down here, detain all the people up here. The numbers are a little bit hard to see. The point is, judges, when they see somebody who's 18 to 20 years old and has a history for prior failures to appear, they detain them about 50% of the time. They also detain people who are in their 50s with one past failure to appear. They also detain them about 50% of the time. So empirically, judges aren't discriminating between these two types of people. Their job is actually only to detain people who are deemed high risk, who have a high likelihood of failing to appear in the future. But in fact, these two groups, which are quite different. This is a low risk group over here. This is one of the lowest risk groups that we see. So relatively old individuals with only one prior failure to appear versus relatively young individuals with a history of failing to appear. And judges are treating them the exact same. So when you do that, the effect is going to be you're detaining many, many more people because you're not concentrating your resources on low risk individuals. And again, this has these equity implications because who interacts with the criminal justice system? Predominantly minorities. And so when you're locking up more people, again, remember this is all done under the presumption of innocence. When you're locking up more people pre-trial, you're mostly locking up people who are black and Hispanic. Okay, so now a question that comes up is, are these algorithms fair? And fair is a tricky thing to define. So I'll try to walk you through a couple ways of thinking about this. But we have these algorithms, and hopefully I've convinced you that these algorithms can significantly improve on human decision-making, reducing the biases of human decision-making, and has these tangible benefits to society. At the same time, we worry, is this really a fair algorithm? And recently, there's been quite a lot of media attention with claims like this, that the software used to predict these types of future criminal activity are biased against blacks. Okay, so let's try to dissect this claim. So first, the one thing that drives a lot of these claims is this fact, that black defendants, when under these algorithms, are detained more often than whites. So the algorithms don't use race directly. So the algorithm is roughly what I showed you. They're looking at criminal history, looking at age. But under the algorithm, more black defendants are detained than white defendants. Overall, the total number of defendants detained is less than there's fewer than under the with no algorithm. But when we say under the algorithm, we find a disproportionate number of black defendants rated high risk by the algorithm. So what do you think of this claim? So this is true. It's a true fact about the world that when you apply these types of algorithms, black defendants are rated high risk and hence detained more often than white defendants. So what do you think about this in terms of whether the algorithm is fair? How many people think this is unfair? So some people, fair? Everyone thinks it's fair? Okay, everyone's scared after the first question. So I'm going to claim this is actually not, again, strong evidence that the algorithm is unfair. So why is this happening? Why is it that black defendants are more likely to be detained by the algorithm in a way that's roughly consistent with what we would think is fair? So it's the same issue that we had before with human tests for discrimination. So what is going on here? Yeah, is that?
Wait, can you repeat your question?
So the question is so the claim that's often made is that these types of algorithms are unfair, and one point of evidence for that is that black defendants under these algorithms are rated higher risk on average than white defendants. Okay, so if you look at blacks as a group and whites as a group, a disproportionate number of black defendants are rated high risk than white defendants. Now the algorithm is using things like criminal history and age, like the algorithm that I showed you earlier. Yeah, so why is this fact not necessarily indicative of the algorithm being unfair? Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's just like the judge's decision and they're like going against the algorithm and they're just like, okay, well, this is a black person, so he has or she has a high risk of being like, I don't know, a high risk person, so they're like, you have to be detained. Yeah,
so this is one possibility. That's actually not the algorithm, that it's the way these algorithms are implemented. It turns out that even if we just look at the algorithm, this is true. So the algorithm will, so if you look at this algorithm that I just described over here, this algorithm will rate black defendants on average higher risk than white defendants. So why is that? How can that happen? Yeah.
Maybe like the areas that they're coming from? Like there's like socioeconomic factors that play, maybe their availability to get to court might have impacted their score.
So it could be the case. There are a couple, let me try to unpack this. Well, this history here, the point is, how can this algorithm end up in more black defendants than white defendants detained? Well, one of these two things has to be different. And it's true that in many of these areas that the skew on age is a little bit younger for minorities than for whites. But the predominant thing is this history of past missed court dates is higher for minorities than for whites. And so if your goal is to detain people who are likely to skip court, then in fact you're going to end up with detaining more minorities. Now, why would many people call this still fair? This is the system we're working in, that if you believe that our goal, conditional on our goal being trying to eliminate flight risk or trying to reduce flight risk or trying to increase public safety, so the exact same argument holds when we look at public safety. Criminal records tend to be higher for minorities, then any algorithm, any decision, human or otherwise, that tries to reduce flight risk or increase public safety will also result in detaining more minorities. Because as a group, for a variety of complex socioeconomic reasons, minorities are higher risk. Okay, so defendants with more serious criminal histories are more likely to reoffend, and they're more likely to be detained, and black defendants on average have more serious criminal histories. So this is one way in which these algorithms are operating. Now, one question that comes up is, are the data biased? Okay. So is it the, yeah?
Well, it seems to me that the algorithm that estimates whether someone is likely to miss a court date has nothing to do whether they're likely to commit a crime.
Yeah, so these jurisdictions, they tend to be split in two. So in New York, for example, by law you can only consider flight risk. And so you detain people precisely when you believe that they're at jeopardy of not showing up to court. And then in other jurisdictions like San Francisco, you primarily detain based on public safety. So what is their likelihood of committing a violent crime? So I've been kind of talking about these loosely, but usually in these jurisdictions, they're one or the other. So in New York, you're focused mostly on flight risk, and in San Francisco, you're mostly focused on public safety. So, and then you use different scores. So now you're saying, well, I'm going to try to predict someone's likely to commit a crime, a violent crime, or I'm going to try to predict their likelihood of skipping court. So it's true that you don't use your flight risk score to figure out is somebody likely to commit a violent crime or vice versa. Does that answer the?
Kind of. It seems to me that you're assuming somebody might be guilty before they've even been.
Yeah, so this is.
You're supposed to assume they're innocent.
So this is exactly the issue that comes up, is that there's this, and this I would say is a broader problem, and I think this is actually a pretty serious problem. It calls into question the entire idea of pretrial detention. Should we be making this decision at all? And I'll come back to this at the end. should we be detaining people who have not skipped court yet, but we only estimate that we believe that they will skip court? Now, that is by law what we have to do. Now, we can change that, and I actually do think we should change that, but if that is the goal, if that's the narrow decision that we're trying to make, and the option is have a human do that, or have an algorithm help the human do that, then in fact I would argue that the algorithm helping the human is much better. It ends up resulting in fewer people detained, and at the same time having, in terms of public safety or in terms of flight risk, having equal along those two dimensions. But there's this pretty serious question I'm going to come back to the end, is should we be doing this at all? But that's orthogonal to the question of, given that we are doing that, and that is the reality of the US criminal justice system, is that we are doing this right now, should we have a human making this decision, or should we have an algorithm helping a human make this decision? Okay, so let me give you an example of why bias data can be a problem. So St. George's Hospital in the UK, they developed this algorithm to essentially do the same thing, but they're looking at medical applications. And they wanted to train the algorithm to mimic past admissions decisions made by humans. So here it's not the judge trying to decide who to detain and not to detain. They're just trying to predict, well, who should we, or trying to estimate who's going to be a good student? Who should we let in? And here they don't have an objective or sense of who is a good student, who's a bad student. This is, what does that even mean? And so instead what they're saying is, well, let's look at our past decisions. And we'll use the algorithm to basically just do our job. We'll say, well, this is what we did before, so now we're going to have the algorithm replicate that decision process. So this went horribly wrong. So any idea what happened here? So this is often a very bad idea, to train to human decisions. So why would you train? So what is the problem with training to human decisions? What's the problem with human decisions?
It's not a problem. It's just it's so wide range that you can't put it into an algorithm.
So they turned out they actually could replicate human decisions quite well, but by replicating human decisions, they're replicating all the biases of human decisions. So they were literally just saying, we're going to take this algorithm, and it's the exact same thing if we had an army of humans making that decision. The humans aren't any better. They're just literally replicating, or figuratively replicating, these biased human decision makers. And so this algorithm, past human decisions were biasing against women and minorities. By running it through this algorithm and essentially replicating those exact same biases, they're codifying the issues with the human decisions. Okay, so now back to the criminal justice setting. What kind of bias could we have in the data? Well, here we could say that the reported crime, arrests, things like this, are a proxy for actual crime. And if it's the case that minorities are more likely to be arrested for crimes than whites, then these types of algorithms can be misleading. Now, the flip side of this is, so for drug crimes, this is certainly the case. So if you look at surveys, then whites and blacks are using recreational drugs, minor drugs, at mostly the same rates, but arrests for drugs disproportionately skew towards blacks and Hispanics. So there's a serious bias for minor crimes. For more serious crimes, this doesn't seem to be as big an issue. We don't have strong evidence that suggests that there's this type of bias in the data for serious crimes, usually violent crimes. But it's still something to be concerned about. So our algorithm is fair, and I'll end with this. It's complicated. It's not clear. And just like these tests for discrimination with humans, it's not clear if algorithms are fair. And first, I would like to say, though, disparate impact is not the same thing as discrimination. It's not the same thing as being unfair. But at the same time, it's complicated. What does fair mean? And if we have bias in the data, how do we work around that? We have humans and algorithms are forced to use the same underlying data. But at the same time, we might not fundamentally feel that this is the best we can do. It might be the best that we can do right now, but I think this sense of unfairness is this standard of what we could do, perhaps in the future, hopefully in the near future. Okay, so where does this leave us? Now, there are a couple options. So the first is that we stop using algorithms. And I would say that I personally would not advocate for this, because despite all these issues that we discussed with algorithms, at the same time, unaided humans are typically worse than humans that are aided by algorithms. So when these algorithms are deployed, we see fewer individuals are detained. Those individuals those individuals who are not detained tend to disproportionately be black and Hispanic. And when these algorithms are deployed, even though you're detaining these individuals, you don't see an increase in crime. You don't see an increase in failure to appear rates. And so society doesn't see the direct effects in terms of public safety or flight risk, but individuals and their families and society indirectly is seeing the benefits of detaining fewer people. And so aiding, so these types of decisions I think are better made with algorithms. Now, option 2 is that we don't just recognize, so we're going to use algorithms, but at the same time we'll recognize and address these types of systemic problems that algorithms can't address. So algorithms are very good at making these narrow decisions. Is this person risky? Is this person not risky? But they can't make these policy decisions. Should we eliminate bail entirely? Some cities have done this, eliminated money bail. And that's a policy decision that still has to be made by humans. And so the one worry about using algorithms is that it sanitizes this process and it stops people from making the high-level policy choices that you have to make. And I would push back against that and say, accept algorithms for what they are, helping you make the narrow decision, but realize that they're a tool. They're not setting policy. They're not telling you how much you invest in education, how much should you invest in infrastructure, how much should you invest in pretrial services, should you eliminate money bail altogether. At the same time, if we're working in the system and we're trying to improve decisions narrowly within that system, then algorithms are a helpful tool in that, for that goal. Okay, so I tried to show you that data and algorithms are not only transforming the criminal justice system, but they do have the potential to dramatically improve decision making, the promise of greater equity, efficiency, and transparency, these very simple rules that people can look at and hopefully have trust that their decision was being made on equitable grounds. At the same time, there are all these legal, social, and ethical challenges that we're only beginning to understand, and we really have to start thinking about as these algorithms become increasingly used in all sorts of aspects of the criminal justice system. I'll end there. Thanks. So I'm happy to take questions if there. Mm-hmm.
So like when the police are gonna stop somebody, how do they determine like whether that's a person's like a risk or not? Because I didn't know how you said in the court they have to go over like the 10 to see if they're gonna be detained or whatever. But like how do they do that?
So we developed rules that look essentially the same as that rule. So they fit on a note card, and so you're looking at a few different factors. We focus on 3 different factors. One is suspicious object. Are they carrying suspicious objects? One is a suspicious bulge. This is their language. That do they see this bulge in someone's jacket usually, and the other sights and sounds of criminal activity. So these are the 3 factors that we focus on. And they're recording something like 18 different factors, and some of these factors that we don't use are things like furtive movement. And so furtive movement has been called out in particular for something that was a catch-all phrase of I want to stop this person, but I don't necessarily have a very explicit reason for doing it. And it turns out that stops that are predicated on furtive movements tend to be not only unproductive, but they also tend to skew heavily towards Black and Hispanic individuals. And so doing the statistical analysis, we determined that the stops that you do want to make are the ones that satisfy these 3 criteria that I outlined. And we also have these thresholds by neighborhood. And so in every neighborhood, you sum the scores, and the officer would say, in this neighborhood, this is the threshold for stopping, and in this neighborhood, this is the other threshold for stopping. So it's against a mental rule. You don't have to use a computer, and that's exactly what we're trying to go for. We wanted these all to fit on a note card. Yes.
Do you believe that the rising tensions between media and police has maybe acted as a catalyst to further try to form technologies or algorithms to help with criminal justice systems?
So it's a good question. So historically, these have been in use for a long time. There's actually, in criminal justice, it goes back almost 100 years to these very simple types of statistical decision procedures that are being used to make decisions. And so there's a long history of doing it. We've become increasingly sophisticated, but there is a long history in using statistics in the criminal justice system. The flip side is, especially for algorithmic fairness, last summer, ProPublica, this investigative news organization, broke this story, the one that I showed, that made this provocative claim that algorithms are biased against Black defendants. And that really spurred, in myself, it affected the work that I'm doing, spurred this interest in understanding what does it mean for an algorithm to be fair, and how can we construct algorithms that we do believe are fair. So certainly there is this interplay between the media and the court system and criminal justice system as a whole. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How do you think defendants would react to and basically being put into a data-based system to decide their fate on the bail or whether or not they're released?
Yeah, I think this is a good question, and it depends on what your counterfactual is. So in one world, we don't make the decision, and I think there's a strong argument to be made for saying we shouldn't be making these types of minority-style predictions about someone's likelihood of committing a future crime on statistics or on anything. So that's one world where you say, well, no one likes this because they haven't committed the crime yet. And so why are you punishing the individual before they've committed a crime? And that actually violates, that idea of punishing people before they've committed a crime violates a lot of norms in other parts of the criminal justice system. So I think there's a strong case to be made that captures a lot of people's beliefs that they don't want to be analyzed statistically or otherwise for something they haven't committed yet. So that's one possibility. Now the other possibility is the reality, and this is the reality, these decisions are being made. Now if your option from it as a defendant is that a judge is going to look at you, going to look at your case history, is going to spend about 2 minutes making this decision, is not going to be able to justify why they made that decision, and you don't have any easy recourse, versus here is a systematic rule that's going to be applied to all defendants. It's based on things like prior criminal history, and that is how the decision can be made. I would say that personally, I would feel that I'm being treated more fairly if it were this clear rule that everybody knew going in, and you could check that it was being applied equitably. But again, I want to couch this in that this is assuming we have to make this decision. And a lot of people just don't want this decision to be made because they haven't committed the crime yet, so why should you punish them? In the back? Okay.
So how can citizens like advocate for like in and out cops in like certain areas? Because like in my experience, like there'll be like a ton of cops like in West Oakland, but then someone's like getting robbed in Oakland Hills. So how can we even advocate for like that ratio?
So it's a really good question. So I have limited experience with actually changing policy at that level. There's a strong statistical argument not to do that type of thing. And that's exactly what we're seeing in stop and frisk in New York, that a lot of the bad stops, these quote-unquote bad stops, the ones that are least productive, are happening in these high crime, high minority neighborhoods precisely because there are a lot of police resources in that neighborhood, and that makes the cost of conducting a stop relatively low. And so this is one argument against having this type of heavy enforcement in these high crime, high minority neighborhoods, because you're basically going to say, we're going to police a lot of people. And so there's a strong statistical argument not to do that. And also interestingly, when I said we had these thresholds set up for every region in New York City that says when you should make the stops. In these high crime, high minority neighborhoods, the thresholds counterintuitively are higher than in these low crime neighborhoods. So that means that in these high crime neighborhoods, you actually need more evidence of more of these objective factors to be checked before you can justify making the stop. And so it's this interesting thing. Here we think that's playing into probably some implicit bias, that if you see somebody walking around in Harlem with a baseball bat, you're like, oh, that sounds like trouble, that looks like trouble. You see the exact same thing happening on the Upper West Side, which is predominantly white, then you'd be like, oh, the person's going to a baseball game. So it's like the exact same thing that's happening, people interpret it in a different way. They say this object is suspicious, this object, because of the context, and people are making those types of judgments in ways that aren't productive in these high crime, high minority neighborhoods, at least in New York City. So I'm not sure what the best way is to advocate for changing these types of policies, but I do think there's a strong statistical argument for doing exactly what you're suggesting.
Are there other aspects of the justice system that use algorithms?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so people are using this in corrections quite a lot. It's even starting to be used a little bit in sentencing, and so it's really quite widespread. Anytime there's a risk, direct risk that you're trying to estimate, algorithms are often used in one way or another. One place that it's not being used is in fact finding. And so, for example, replacing the jury or even assisting a jury with an algorithm is a much harder thing to do than this narrow problem of estimating an individual's risk. And so that's the dichotomy, that when you're estimating risk, in pretty much any aspect of the criminal justice system, you see some form of an algorithm. But if you're trying to do some kind of more of this unstructured problem of is this statement true, or what do I believe this witness, this is a lot harder to have an algorithm help you with that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I agree with pretty much everything you said. My question comes from, like, where do we go from here? And this is kind of where I'm a bit skeptical and pessimistic. And that it seems that the non-statistician observer and user of the algorithm as a tool makes the algorithm itself uncomfortable in this between this dichotomy of being a tool or being a totalitarian numbers authority, where in order to have the algorithm be a tool for our society, it seems like it needs to be constantly flowing with policy and so on, sociological changes and so on. But the worry is that for me, I'm not a statistician, I don't know how to develop these algorithms and so on and so on. I could either see it as this lightweight tool that I still have authority on that tool, so it doesn't really mean as much because my conscience, I kind of put a bias towards it. Or on the other hand, I could say, no, this is the law. This number that these statisticians have developed is the proper way in which we should go about working with our society. So how do we kind of see algorithms as tools in this harmony with ourselves without being weaker?
Yeah, so I think it's a good point, and I think it's a good point to end on. So I think it's exactly a tool, and so we can't think of this as a pure, this is it, unchanging. 50 years from now, we're going to be using the exact same risk scores, and we do have to keep on thinking about how do we update these things. And we've tried to make the process of updating these tools very, very simple. So we designed the process of updating these tools, which I didn't cover, in a way that essentially anyone with very limited background can carry out. At the same time, it does require a fair amount of investment from these criminal justice organizations. And so I think it's a hard problem to solve. Okay,
Thank you very much.